This is Mexico. It's the 13th largest country in the world and the second largest economy in Latin America. But despite this, it's often looked down upon by its northern neighbour, the United States. However, its close proximity to America is also becoming a massive strategic advantage, which is fueling its economic growth. The two countries share an 1,954-mile-long border, 54 border crossings and 4 time zones, which has created a strong trade relationship between them, beneficial for both countries, but particularly for Mexico. This can clearly be seen on this map. This shows GDP per capita, an indirect indicator of economic activity and income in each of Mexico's 31 states. What we can clearly see is that GDP is concentrated in Mexico's northern regions sharing a border with the US. These states have been able to establish a strong export base and are far less reliant on commodities than southern regions. But this is a phenomenon which is likely to spread across the whole country in just a few years. By looking at quarterly economic activity from 2023, as well as the established northern regions, we can see significant growth in the south, in particular in Oaxaca and Tabasco. This sudden surge in growth is thanks to a phenomenon called nearshoring. That is the practice of transferring a business operation to a nearby country from one further away, and it's gaining traction as American, European and Asian companies are moving their operations to Mexico. Because of this, foreign investment has flooded into Mexico, and 2023 saw the largest year on record with 18% year-on-year growth. This will undoubtedly continue, as heightened global tensions between the United States and China and increasing trade wars and tariff has made manufacturing goods in China less attractive for American and European firms, who are now turning their attention just across the southern border. Even by the most liberal estimates, Mexico is not going to come near to eclipsing China as the leading global exporter, but it still offers a massive growth opportunity for the country, as in February 2024, Mexico overtook China as the leading source of imports for the US. This has fueled further growth in Mexico, ranking as one of the G20's fastest growing economies in 2023, something which is seeing wage growth increase at a record pace. The nation is of course not without its problems. Mexico remains deeply unequal, with large portions of wealth being occupied by a small percentage of the population, giving it the second highest degree of income inequality amongst OECD nations. Around 1 in 3 people in the country live in a state of poverty, and even though this is an improvement from 43% in 2016, it's still far too high for a country looking to push towards a rich status. This is allowed to persist due to one of the nation's most famous but illicit industries. Mexico has long had a reputation for illegal activity, especially around the drug industry, being home to many cartels. High levels of crime and homicide don't usually correlate with business investment, and as such, these issues have halted Mexico's economic growth, giving rise to a large informal sector to go with it. Whilst criminal activity certainly plays a large role in Mexico's unofficial economy, it's not going to be a key area of focus in today's video. So with that in mind, let's look at why Mexico is finally advancing to become a developed and wealthy nation. Since the colonial era, Mexico's economy has been characterized by resource extraction. As we saw before, Mexico is a really large country, which is home to a wealth of natural resources, possessing large stores of silver and other minerals which have developed significant investment for mining. However, the most important event in the development of Mexico's economy came with the discovery of large oil fields in the early 20th century. The discovery of the Cerro Azul field in 1916 was particularly important, as whilst people knew that there was oil in the Gulf of Mexico, no one knew just how much. At the time of discovery, this oil field was the most productive in the world, producing over 260,000 barrels of oil per day at its peak. The discovery of these and other fields propelled Mexico to become one of the world's leading oil producers in the early 20th century, which has had a profound impact on its economic development over the next few decades. Exporting oil has allowed the nation to generate significant amounts of revenue, especially in periods of high oil prices. And whilst development and drilling was originally undertaken by private companies, this was a source of contention for the Mexican government, and they soon made the move to nationalize the industry. Pemex, the state-owned oil company, was created in 1938 it meant that the exploration, extraction, and sales of natural gas and petrol has gone through the state ever since. This has had a number of advantages. Primarily, Pemex's revenues have been a significant source of government income, historically around 30 to 40% of total fiscal revenues. Following the worldwide Great Depression of the late 1920s and 1930s, Mexico's economy had begun to grow steadily. And by 1950, Mexico seemed poised for an economic takeoff, which would take place in a period known as the Mexican Economic Miracle. At this time, more and more workers were flowing into cities, manufacturing was increasing as a share of GDP, and agricultural production was declining, and education was spreading throughout the country as literacy rates rapidly increased. Between 1950 and 1981, real GDP in Mexico grew by 6.5% a year, and despite a high rate of population growth, real GDP per working age person grew by 3.6%. In this boom period, the government began heavy investment in things that would improve the lives of its citizens, things like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Hopes for more growth were boosted again as further discoveries of oil fields in 1977 increased Mexico's proven oil reserves by 151%. With this discovery, the government further expanded its public expenditure, meaning that for the first time in the country's history, the demand for elementary school education was fully satisfied. However, at the beginning of the 1980s, things start to go quite wrong for Mexico. Its use of oil revenues, which had been a blessing for so long, quickly became a curse. In the times of high oil prices in the 1970s, Mexico had been generating high export revenues on the international market, and had been using this to borrow heavily in order to fund its public sector expansion program. Accordingly, foreign sector debt went from $4.3 billion in 1970 to $58.9 billion in 1982. However, a rapid fall in the price of oil around the end of the 70s, caused by a surplus of oil on the global market, meant that Mexico's export revenues dropped significantly, while spending remained relatively similar, causing a public deficit of 17.6%. Mexico and other oil-exporting Latin nations could no longer meet their debt payments, and finally, in 1982, the Mexican government defaulted on its loan payments, thus starting the 1982 debt crisis. What resulted was 10 years of stagnation, high inflation, and low growth, often referred to as the lost decade. Following the crash, oil prices did pick up again, and Mexico benefited greatly from the commodity supercycle of the late 90s and early 2000s, where most commodities experienced double-digit annual real price growth, and with this, their economy began to recover. Today, oil is still a crucial element of the Mexican economy, and it accounts for around 20% of government revenues. But moving away from oil as a source of economic growth and income has long been a desired goal of the Mexican government. And since the 1990s, this has taken shape in a few different areas. Firstly, with trade. In 1994, Mexico entered the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, with Canada and the United States, essentially allowing Mexico and Canada to trade freely with the US, reducing tariffs on most goods and services, and eliminating many barriers to cross-border investment. Reducing these barriers has allowed exports in Mexico to boom. As a share of GDP, they have more than doubled to 41% from 1994 to 2021, and in the same period, the value of Mexico's exports in constant dollars rose more than fourfold to $465 billion, a pace that compares favourably with countries such as Thailand and Malaysia. In this period, Mexico has also significantly diversified its exports, as focus has moved away from agricultural goods and oil towards more labour-intensive manufactured goods like electronics and auto parts, industries which have seen significant growth. Following the crisis of the 1980s, Mexico had very high levels of government debt. However, the subsequent trade surpluses from NAFTA have allowed large foreign exchange reserves to be accumulated and reduced this total figure. And aside from increasing government revenues, trade has had a number of beneficial knock-on effects for the Mexican economy. Even though NAFTA has now been replaced by the USMCA agreement, the reductions of tariffs and trade barriers, as well as Mexico's proximity to the world's largest economy, has led to a surge in investment, FDI specifically, and these flows are estimated to be around 60% higher than they would be without the agreement. The manufacturing industry in particular has benefited from FDI by expanding and modernizing its operations, and many American companies have moved parts of their operation across the border to establish production centers and lower their costs. The stimulation of investment from NAFTA has also led to the creation of many new jobs, providing a viable source of income for many Mexicans, helping to draw more and more workers into formal employment away from their previous jobs, providing them with pensions and job security that they lacked before. These jobs also tend to be in industries that often require higher skill levels than traditional agricultural or low-skilled jobs, and increased demand for higher skilled jobs means that workers are encouraged to seek higher education and vocational training, equipping the local workforce with better skills and increasing their earning potential. The practice of nearshoring is not just limited to companies from the United States, but also ones from Europe and China, as Chinese firms are beginning to invest billions of dollars in Mexico due to rising shipping costs and increased trade wars for fear of losing their main market in the US. And in 2023, most of this added spending was reinvestment by companies already with a presence in Mexico, which suggests that the nearshoring phenomenon is just in its infancy and Mexico will continue to grow as a manufacturing power. Further requirements placed by the USMCA also require a certain percentage of goods to be made in North America for them to be tariff-free, for example 75% on automobiles. This has led to a rise in assembly plants across the country where a Made in Mexico sticker can be attached to lower costs. Such an influx of investment in these areas is likely to have a significant multiplier effect across the economy, as spending increases in other areas like infrastructure and telecommunications. Despite the general sense of optimism around Mexico's economy, there has been a fear that Mexico still lacks a few crucial ingredients to fully propel itself to the status of a developed nation. Mexico's real GDP per capita grew on average by 0.7% from 1980 to 2019. To put that into perspective, it's considerably below similar countries that started from comparable income levels. Over the same period, Chile averaged 3% growth and South Korea 5.3%. And low productivity gains explain this gap, something which has remained relatively stagnant since the 1980s. In this period, Mexico's economic growth has largely been driven by an expanding labour force. Yet this progress has been offset by poor total factor productivity gains, that is, how efficiently inputs are used in creating an output. Productivity is the primary driver of growth in most advanced and emerging economies, and something which has been lacking in Mexico. Their rapidly expanding workforce has meant that there has been a growing pool of working-age individuals in the economy, essentially meaning that they are increasing their inputs rather than using them more efficiently. But this boom in the workforce is expected to end by around 2030, and its fertility rate of 1.9 children per woman is far below the number of children needed to keep the population stable from generation to generation. Another area detracting from Mexico's productivity and growth are its levels of education. Mexico currently has one of the lowest rates of educational attainment and enrollment in the OECD countries, and whilst this is steadily going up, it's still a factor which is holding it back. Higher levels of education improve the skills of the workforce, which can lead to more efficient use of existing technologies and greater output, ultimately meaning higher wages. More specifically, for Mexico, enhancing educational outcomes could help address some of the structural challenges that hinder productivity growth, such as inequality in education access and quality between urban and rural areas. For those of you watching who are also looking to increase their educational attainment, then the sponsor of today's video, Brilliant.org, is likely to help. Brilliant offers a unique approach to learning that helps you learn by doing, giving visual, interactive, and hands-on approach to learning that's not only really effective, but also really fun, meaning you can master concepts in as little as 15 minutes per day. It isn't just for super tough concepts either, and offers education no matter your starting level. Each lesson is filled with hands-on problem solving that lets you play with concepts, a method proven to be 6 times more effective than watching full lecture videos, and helps develop critical thinking skills. Brilliant also launched a ton of new content in data, all of which uses real-world data to train you to see trends and make better informed decisions, and they cover many more topics from AI to engineering. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/invisiblehand or click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks again to Brilliant for sponsoring today's video. Productivity is also stalling in Mexico because of its large informal sector. Most modern developed economies are typically made up of formal businesses that are registered with the government. But in Mexico, the informal economy is made up of mainly small businesses that are not taxed or regulated, and accounts for a staggering 24% of its GDP and 55% of employment. Workers in this sector lack benefits such as healthcare and pensions, and because informal firms are off the books, they typically cannot borrow from banks, so not only is their growth limited, but government tax collection is also significantly lower. This ties into the poor access to loans and credit, which is a severe limiting factor for Mexico's growth. Despite extensive banking reforms following the financial crash in the 1990s, the country's financial sector remains notable for its low levels of credit extended to firms and households. In the 21st century, domestic credit to the private sector as a share of GDP averaged just 24%, compared with 99% in Chile, 51% in Brazil, and 131% in Korea. Such a low rate of credit hampers production, capital formation, and innovation that ultimately generates economic growth. So where does this leave Mexico to grow from here? The country clearly has a lot of potential to become a developed nation, but as we saw in our video about Germany, an over-reliance on trade can both be a blessing and a curse for an economy, and the scale of its relationship with the US is also a concern. America accounts for 80% of Mexico's exports, meaning that changes in this trading relationship in the future stand to have a large effect on the Mexican economy and jobs. This is particularly relevant in 2024, as both Mexico and the USA have elections, meaning that the outcomes of these could significantly alter the two countries' relationships and ultimately their entire economies. However, Mexico's proximity to the world's largest economy makes it a different case from Germany, as it's actually further benefiting from deglobalization and a move away from China. Nonetheless, trade and manufacturing will undoubtedly play a huge role in the Mexican growth to come. And unlike some of the European economies that we have covered, Mexico also has a very young demographic which is continuing to grow, meaning that more and more people will be entering the workforce, and they will also not be troubled by large welfare payments on healthcare and pensions like European countries. The growth of the country is expected to continue to rise and grow over the next couple years as nearshoring becomes a bigger phenomenon. But what it needs to make sure is that it effectively uses the inflow of investment and capital to build the long-term capacity of its economy to reduce inequality instead of squandering the money.